Thank you, Sandra. Thank you all for coming on a sunny Wednesday. Well done for not being in a pub garden, being in a bookshop instead. My name is Nell Frizzell. I am an author and journalist, and despite how I'm dressed, not a plumber. I just buy their clothes on Vinted because they're very, very comfortable. I have the great pleasure tonight of grilling the amazing Danny Dorling, Professor of Geography at Oxford University, local boy done good. Are we allowed to say that?
Yeah.
He grew up in Headington, loves Finland. He's the author of loads of books, Peak and Justice, 7 Children, Population 10 Billion, Slow Down. I mean, actually, how many books have you written now?
Quite a lot of it with other people.
Okay.
But this is 59.
Bloody hell!
Yeah.
Okay, so 59, I can't wait what 60 is going to be. This is Danny's latest book, The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future. And as the title would suggest, it's all about our anxieties, our worries, our fears. So if this turns into a little group therapy session at the end, that's absolutely fine, because I'm going to be taking questions from the audience. If your question is, Danny, will you please hold me? I'm worried. I think that would probably be okay. But I am going to ask questions, and then I will throw to you all for your questions, which is the sort of time when the really good questions come out. So have a think about that. Danny, you have said before that you became a geographer because of a particular roundabout.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
Okay. So, what have I come up with publicly? I've done this. My mum and dad were students here. And in fact, my dad was still a student when I was born. And they were students at the university, the old one. And they lived in various rented flats up in North Oxford, on Margaret Road and on Canal Street and so on. Often having to pretend they didn't live together, because back then the age of majority is 21, you weren't allowed to do that. You certainly weren't allowed to have sex and produce a baby. So I'll get to the roundabout in a minute.
No, that's fine.
So I was conceived on the street in Jericho where there were 3 brothels, and I couldn't be born there because there were 3 brothels, and apparently that's not done. If you don't know, Jericho is now one of the most expensive areas of Oxford, but was one of the cheapest. So my mum and dad managed to get a house, 3-bed semi, on Churchill Road next to County Centre. That was the first 6 years of my life. I can remember dragging my mum's hand, trying to get her away from chatting to people in the shops then. We ended up with 4 of us, that's 4 little boys, and that was too many for a 3-bed semi. So I moved to Risinghurst when I was 6 years old. And it was a time of freedom when you'd let kids just go. And I had a trike, which is great because it's really stable. And I got to explore. I got to go out and actually draw a map of where I was. I even created a Monopoly board later of, if you want to know the poshest and the least posh streets in Risinghurst, I can tell you what a 6 or 7 year old thinks. I discovered Narnia because I climbed over the gate and got into it. It was locked at the time. I much later found out it's actually C.S. Lewis's garden. It had a lamppost, it had lakes, it really was Narnia. And I went to school to Wood Farm, where your
My husband is a teacher.
And then heading to Middle and got to go on my own, and this involved going under the subway, under the Green Roundabout. Now the subway under the Green Roundabout used to be very different to what it is now. Now it's been opened up to try to make it safe and not frightening. Back then, the entrances were small and dark, it was full of graffiti, and it was essentially where, if you were a boy aged 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16, it's where you fought. Because there are children coming from all directions, and they're coming from different estates. There's the council estate, which is Barton. Risinghurst at the time was the cheapest private estate. Quarry was just about becoming posh, is now posher. Wasn't originally, if you know the history of the Quarry. And then a little bit of Headington, which is where doctors might live on the other side. So the roundabout had...
Who won in the fights?
who was best at fighting, which wasn't... I can remember a really little lad who jumped up about a foot high and smashed me in the nose once. So you couldn't necessarily...
Was he the son of a doctor?
No, he wasn't. I got good at fighting. At Henton Middle I was the hardest in the third year. Some people's made a song about being hardest in the year. That's age 12. And the sad thing is, though, eventually later on in your life, you realise what hardest in the third year means is I was probably a bully. But learned to fight. We were not settled at Henton Middle, but the minute you walk into Cheney, this is age 13 back then, you're put into either P1, P2, P3, P4, P5, 13 each, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, Q5, another 13 each, or R for remedial. Right? It was fairly blatant back then. If you're in P1 and P2, you're allowed to do O-levels. P2, P3, P4, you would be doing CSEs. And then there were kind of like still school certificate partly. I've got this wrong, but Cheney was and is the average school of England, and so has a wide span. The sets that people were put into were not based on ability. They were based, all the middle class kids, which there weren't many, were put into set 1 immediately. Then it began to depend on how you did, and whether you left at 15 or 16 and went into little sixth form, depended on where you were going through the subway. That became more and more obvious to me, about your futures and about how things were arranged. Why it matters later is that on the map of deprivation of the UK, that roundabout still is one of the few areas which has all 5 colours around it. There are not many places in Britain where that degree of social inequality is so close together so that you can get to see it. And that must have had an effect on me. And the embarrassment of being a doctor's son. The minute I've told you I'm a doctor's son, you've worked out my class position, which is nice and easy. There may only have been one other doctor's child, at least in the year I was in, out of 330 children. You have to be very slow to not realise you're incredibly well off. Yeah. And back then, GPs were just in the top 1%. Their salary in today's money is about 50 or 60,000. So you may not think not very much, but nobody else was paid as much as a doctor. So you're acutely aware of where you are, what happens, and the fact that I was going to go to university irrespective of my abilities. I was the last child to learn to read and write in my class. It really didn't matter, and with a few tiny exceptions, you could predict what was happening to people. There was the one odd child who was the son or daughter of a car worker who then went and did that. 1 out of over 300. Yeah.
So what we used to call this in the old days class consciousness, I suppose. You were getting at Cheney. I also went to Cheney.
Oh.
And I think then Cheney celebrated itself on being the comprehensive school with the most second languages spoken in the city.
Yeah.
That was our big claim to fame.
Yeah.
Did you go to Cheney as well? No. But that was its big thing, that we were sort of a multicultural school. But it's an interesting that spurred on this understanding of social hierarchies and how inequality can sort of interrupt other markers, education, health, all of that sort of stuff.
Urdu was the second language at Cheney when I went, and was big. And it was, but later, it's the bog standard comprehensive. So half the comprehensives in England don't do as well as Cheney, half do better. In upper middle class Oxford, the phrase was ABC, which is anywhere but Cheney. Right? You didn't send there was an irrational fear. And it's changed. I'm not going to ask you how old you are, but watching the change go through, if you sent a boy to Magdalen College, they would have been 20 times more likely to go to university back then. It was really worth spending your money. It absolutely isn't now, by the way. I don't want to upset anybody. But, okay, they're slightly more likely to get into Cambridge, but send them to Charlton if you want that. and he got to ask, why do you want that? But anyway, it's so lucky to go to an average school. An average then meant 2% of children going in their first attempt to university, 1 in 50. That isn't the proportion who went to university overall. That was higher, but of course, even then, they were going from the private schools mostly, or from the very posh grammars or comprehensives, not from an average school. An average school is 2%. For further schools, it was nobody. Nobody went.
Yeah. You write in this, to be able to afford the time to worry about the next crisis, which is what this all is, might be almost entirely an indulgence of those who most of the time are free from great danger and substantial difficulty.
Yeah.
So you've not had much on. You've had time to write this. You've had time to be thinking about this.
Yeah.
Why? Why were you thinking about crises? Apart from you say that crises are what make geography interesting, which I think is hard. Because volcanoes make geography interesting, but also
that's the dark side. All those macho going into deserts, climbing volcanoes, solving climate change. They're called physical geographers. And I'm on the human side, and we have really important topics, and I've mainly do inequality, but they're quite depressing often. Whereas crises are a bit more exciting.
Okay.
And I don't find crises strange, and you may well get annoyed about this. I don't find crises that upsetting.
You seem very calm in the book, I have to say. There is this sort of clinical calm, and maybe that'll be good.
That's because
we're all getting shorter, but hey.
My last 2 or 3 books have been about the UK, and it's been terrible. Writing about the UK in the last few years really has been truly awful. So this is about crises across the globe and what's happening globally. And many countries, the majority of countries of the world have falling inequality within them. These are things that we don't talk about. We concentrate on the problems, the billionaires. We don't talk about health improving in most places, education in most places. And it's good we don't. We're really good at worrying. But worldwide, there are lots of good news stories. The UK, in the last few decades, and particularly the last decade, and particularly the last few years, is truly awful, to a point where, if I tell you it's awful, nobody disagrees anymore. There's no traditional conservative going, oh, but look how entrepreneurial we are. At least all that crap's ended. But it is depressing, talking about Britain. The poorest fifth of people here are poorer than the average poorest fifth in Eastern Europe. We're peripheral and we're going down, and we're divided. And we're not talking about Britain, because it's, yeah.
But interestingly, I don't want to use the word lump, but you lump together these crises into various headings: cost of living, work, sharing work, war and housing together, which I want to ask you about putting those together, cradle to grave, so that's our sort of health and education, the climate crisis, and then you've given yourself a little bonus chapter of biodiversity, which is interesting. But tell me about this. Why do you put, for instance, war and housing together?
That was what I was stuck with after I'd sorted everything out. Be painfully honest. So it's largely based on Ipsos surveys done every month in over 30 countries in the world for quite a long time. They ask 18 questions, that's too many. And also there are big overlaps, of which the biggest is the cost of living crisis coming up, and inequality and poverty being the main concern of most, and this is the middle class of the world. So these things are surprising. Inequality and poverty was seen as the biggest issue until towards the end of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis rose up. But it's a cost of living crisis about affording to get by. It is remarkably similar as an issue to inequality and poverty. So it made sense to lump them together. I had to keep climate change separate because it's so important, especially people in Oxford. I'm going to stereotype, but I couldn't get climate up high enough to qualify for a chapter without amalgamating things that are bigger crises in most people's eyes in the world.
Yes, because just to make it clear, in this Ipsos survey, climate change comes out in the list of sort of 12 things you're worried about. It's sort of 7 or 8, is it?
It's 8 and dropping.
8 and dropping.
And so we're the least climate sceptical country in the world. Only 9% of the people in the UK believe that climate change is a hoax. 9% is very low. And that's partly our political parties had a deal of not fighting each other over this, and our media got to a point of saying we're not going to do balance by having a mad person there saying it's not happening anymore. But even then, people do get tired of constantly being told this is the biggest problem, and being told it often by quite better off people who don't have to worry about getting by, don't worry about unemployment, who aren't worried about local services and what's happening to the schools, and so on. So the first one all made sense, and these two that I amalgamated, the cost of living and inequality and poverty, already paired. Already they were the top two anyway, so I wasn't cheating. I'm just putting them all together and going, this is the big thing in the world. Unemployment used to be the highest before people in the world began to realise that inequality was their problem. Which you've got to take your hats off to social scientists older than me who wrote books about inequality, including quite a lot in this country, and have actually pushed it up on the global agenda to understand your problem is the rich.
Well, you have written 59 books, so
only a few were on, but this began before I started doing it. But before people across the world realised, and it's the middle class, poor people don't fill in surveys, unemployment was the biggest fear. And that shocked me, and this tells you my position out in. And the fact it shocked me, and I work in a sector where half my colleagues across the country is imminently scared about potentially losing their jobs in the university, or that I teach students who are, even ours, are actually worried about will anybody want them, will they get a job. Of course unemployment's this huge fear. You've got to be really, really incredibly well off and secure, and like an Oxford University academic, where I think I may be the first in about 700 years to be sacked, if I am sacked from my current post. It's very, very hard to do it.
Oh, I've got faith in you, Danny.
In that to get sacked. Then when you go down, the one you get is crime and fear of burglary, theft, violent crime, robbery. And that's how I kicked in housing, because it's about the safety of where you live.
Yeah.
This is the most tenuous thing I did. And then because it was about violence, I thought, let's put war here. Because the fear of war, and the fear of war geographically, and I did a detailed map in the book of everybody who's died in all the wars recorded since '89, but that doesn't fit the fear of war. The fear of war is highest in countries either that are at a war or are bordering where a war has begun. And I think I probably put terrorism in there because some countries, people in some countries, don't call it war, they call it terrorism. But it's war, it's violence. Other surveys, if you ask people questions differently, you can get very different responses. If you ask the world's middle class, like representative of the best of 4 billion, if they are frightened of nuclear war, a majority will say yes. They actually are generally frightened of a nuclear war. If you ask, as Ipsos do, this general set of questions, and please say what the worst things are, war goes down. It makes sense to be frightened about war, logically. And of course, a war, compared to being worried about being burgled, war is more serious.
I want to talk to you about immigration, because I say you put immigration. Right.
I put that with unemployment. Yes.
You're right. Immigration does not cause unemployment. It's unemployment that causes emigration.
Yeah.
So why are they not all coming over here and stealing our jobs?
I have to say, I'm going to let's try and be kind. There's somebody who follows me, if I record this, put this up, is based in Manchester, who becomes absolutely irate every time I say in public talks, immigration creates jobs. But the problem is it does, and the more he sends me angry emails, and he sends me graphs, he shouldn't. Some people are really concerned. You shouldn't, by the way, if you're an academic and you get angry emails and letters, think that they represent any more than one person. And I'm lucky because I'm a man and I'm white that I don't take these things too personally. But this man in Manchester is convinced that the immigrants have taken away the jobs. Now, somebody comes to live on this street from another country and squeeze in, they will use the shops locally, create other jobs. Maybe Oxford gets a bit tight, and it is very tight. We can tell from the sewers how many people are in the city, which is more than the official numbers. But the one thing that they're not doing is reducing the number of jobs. It creates more jobs when people come. When people leave, if you think of a city like Glasgow, which people left for over 40 years, or Liverpool, what happens is that other jobs go and that need to be there goes because you've got to start shutting schools. There is less to be done. And this is relatively simple to understand. If people are coming to where you are, they are not going to make things worse economically. You can worry about competing with them, but you've got to be made scared of them. And if you go back to Oxford and think about Oxford in the 60s and 70s, we were made scared enough of people that the trade unions complained about the Polish coming over straight after the Second World War. The unions in the car factory had a colour bar, so if you're black you weren't allowed to work in the factory until the 50s. They had a large number of Afro-Caribbean men working in the factory. Then we have everybody coming from Pakistan to work here, and each of these, it's, we're in liberal Oxford, so I don't have to explain to you about racism. But the idea that this made Oxford worse, if you want to complain about a group coming to Oxford, it's the white upper middle class of England who have come in and in and in again and pushed everybody who went to my school out, so that only people like me can actually be here. But when I arrived back 12 years ago, I brought 4 immigrants from Yorkshire with me, right? And they don't make the thing better. If you're going to worry about immigrants hurting an area, they're largely internal, they're largely posh. If you want to worry about overseas immigrants, the biggest concentration of overseas immigrants in one census were gathered around Hyde Park, where I think 1 in 7 of the children were foreign born. The foreign place that they were born, this biggest concentration of strangers in our land, was the United States of America. And their parents worked in the finance industry. Right? But London has only existed for hundreds of years because of people coming in. It's never been able to reproduce itself, never able to make enough babies.
I don't want to jump immediately from Americans working in finance and living in Hyde Park, but you do write that it may be the case that there are a small group of people who are genetically selfish.
Yes.
And they are the rich.
Yeah.
And you talk about...
well, maybe. I say maybe.
Maybe. Caveat. Any billionaires?
I think this is really worth looking at. And it's something... It's in footnotes in many of my books, because they're about inequality. And the fundamental thing about inequality is people saying, well, people are basically unequal. Some people are very good, some people are very poor. Let's help them all realise their potential. Like the nastiest ever phrase, realise your potential. It got into the UN rights of the child somehow. The implication is that people have different sets of potential, and we can help those little ones with little potential at least become kind of good cleaners for us. Meanwhile, me and my genetically clever, superior children will rise above and do some job that doesn't actually require doing very much. Like this. I'm paid to do this. And so, if you do work in inequality, you have to look into work about genetics and IQ and eugenics. And all of that work is done by people on the right who all believe they're super intelligent. Think of Toby Young. He hasn't sued me yet, but and Toby is an author of papers. And so I read these papers. I look at the genome-wide analysis of things. And actually some of the papers Toby Young was involved with. The fascinating thing is they do find a wide set of genes that do appear to be associated with doing better at school. But those genes are found just as much in grammar school children as in private school children. Now, to get into a grammar school, we only have 163 of them. You do have to pass the test at 11. To get into a private school, you just have to have money. There are private schools with entrance exams, as there are two at least famous in this city. But this city has a whole plethora of what are in effect secondary modern private schools for people who can't get into Oxford High for girls or into Magdalen. So our private school population isn't some specially selected on ability, it's money. And it's even more than that, because you may put your child into a private school because they're doing badly in the state school. But the children in the British private schools have these genes. They can't be genes for being clever, so what are they? And my supposition, and I want the geneticists to look at this, is it would make sense if their genes about being more greedy. And it makes no sense that we have genes for intelligence. Just as we've all got an opposable thumb, we've hopefully mostly got binocular vision, right? By evolution, things are at an advantage you get. It does make sense to have some people being more greedy than others. The clearest genetics of this are the fat gene. I have it, or the fat genes, right? This is one of the things of the human genome we know. And you can feel good about yourself. If you're like me, it's not entirely that I'm a greedy, feckless person, that I'm this size. As my very good friend George David Smith repeatedly tells me, the only way in this environment that I would be svelte is if you put me in a prison cell and pushed lettuce under the thing. Because I am programmed, and you can see it in your family because your family has genes, I am programmed to eat more if it's available. Come the Great Crisis, when the pound collapses to near zero and the food stops coming in, and it turns out the British farmers were right with their tractors and all their protests, and we don't actually have enough food. I won't point out who's going to die first, but I am going to last longer. There is a rationale about why you might have this variation, which is only really exposed in an obesogenic environment, of some people who can eat loads, have a high metabolism, stay thin, and others who get fat and store. It makes sense to have that variation. It may even make sense to have a variety of temperaments, so that some of us decide we want to store the grain because we'd like to make a bit of money selling that grain 2 or 3 years later, but most people are pro-social and not selfish, but not that good at doing that. And you survive as a species with a variety of behaviours, which is fine for most of our evolution, except not now. It's a possibility. But I would just like the people who look at the genes for intelligence to consider that the things they're finding might not be about intelligence, they might be about greed. And if you imagine you're greedy in this city, and you've got some money, or you get it from your greedy parents who are similarly greedy to you, although you can mix with other people, it's not inevitable your children will be greedy. But imagine you've got some money in the city, what do you do with your money? By the time your kids are 15, 1 in 3 of them are going to schools where you pay them money. What are you paying for? You're paying for those exam results. So they're going to look clever. But it ain't cleverness. But that is an effect of having gone to Cheney. Right next to Headington High, by the way, I should point out.
You do say that, and I didn't know this, that politicians assume that we're more right-wing than we really are. So there's always this assumption politically that we are more right-wing, not even more conservative, just more right-wing.
Yeah.
And that actually the population as a whole are probably more open to the ideas of open to policies that would reduce that inequality. You talk about Maureen Ramsey and the maximum wage. Are you all familiar with this? I wasn't familiar about this. Can you tell us about the maximum wage, please?
Or maximum. So most of the stuff in this book, because I am an academic, is reporting other people's results and putting it in a particular order. All I'm really doing is ordering.
You're a parasite.
Yes. Because you can't. Yeah, the greed gene is mine. I'm happy to give it up. The obvious title for the book is The Selfish Genes, plural, by the way, and you could become very famous. And it needs to be done by a geneticist. But apart from a few ideas like that, these are all other people's ideas. And they're particularly ideas that surprised me. And I was surprised to find this big survey of politicians in many countries found that they made assumptions about the electorate, which, there were 2 reasons for this. One was politicians tend to mix with people in their social bracket, which tends to be quite high up, so they're mixing with people who are better off and more right-wing. But secondly, the people who contact politicians tend to be better off. And just like somebody like me gets affected by the man in Manchester sending me emails about immigrants and destroying jobs, You know, they are affected by the letters they get. And it's a mistake to sit here in radical East Oxford and think, oh, but letters to MPs are really good. Like, you need to think, who is it who contacts MPs all the time? And it's well-off people who are really upset that you might be thinking of bringing in rent regulation. Right? Only 2 or 3% of the population are landlords, but boy, are they around. So if you hear a lot from landlords, and hardly any tenant writes to MP saying, I really hate having to pay this rent, so that somebody can go on holidays every year. So you can see how they get that idea, which then explains why our politicians can be more disappointing than we think they ought to be. Because they have this view, and they do the focus groups that tell them, oh, you know, if you're slightly radical, they won't vote for you anymore. And it's used to know. Maximum wage and maximum wealth. There's been, Will Hutton, years and years ago, chaired the 2 inquiries on whether we should have a maximum wage of 12 times the average, or anyway 20 times the average, and we still haven't got it. There's brilliant work being done in the Netherlands on what should the maximum wealth be. How many people think that nobody actually needs more than 10 million euros in this case? Almost nobody thinks anybody needs more than $1 billion, except presumably a few billionaires. and there'll be somebody out there going, oh no, if you don't let people get $1 billion in wealth, nobody will ever start a new factory or something. They need that incentive. But these ideas of maximum wages and maximum wealth are gaining strength on the continent. We used to have the idea when we made people pay income tax rates of over 90% on a certain level. In effect, that was the maximum wage. When we made them pay inheritance tax at a high rate, so they had to give up their country houses, that was a maximum wealth idea that we had in the past. But these are gaining popularity. That we should be setting maximums and changing our taxation systems to really encourage people not to try and acquire more. I don't think I put it in the book because I don't want him to sue me. Go
on.
Oh, I'll tell you. I was going to call this the Jeremy Clarkson tax. Because if you take somebody like Jeremy, who is fairly, I don't know how old he is, fairly old now, fairly well off, fairly high income. Supposing Jeremy's offered a chance to go to Australia and spend 2 months driving cars around roads. I kind of feel that he should only do that if he really wants to do it. And how can you ensure that he only does it if he really wants to do it? Well, given his annual income from all the other things he does is so high, if you have a really high tax rate, say 95% or above on that income, then you're giving him the freedom to decide. I know it's a different way of putting it. The freedom to decide that he'll only do these things at this point if he actually really wants to do them, not because those little genes in him are telling, get some more, Jeremy, you need more money. But it's a positive way of thinking about it. Rich families that I know are not happy.
Well, this is something you've written about over and over again, is that inequality is bad for everyone.
Yeah.
It's bad for people with lots. It's bad for the rich. It's bad for people with secure housing. It's bad for people who are sending their kids to private schools. It's bad for people with lots of cars. It's even bad for people who have millions and millions of pounds that they can't possibly spend in their lifetime. They're having a shit time because of inequality. Explain that.
They or other people in their families are. Especially other people in their families. So often the man, almost always the man, driven to become extremely rich is driven and will never say they're having a bad time, or rarely do. Although Robert Peston's done a study of successful business leaders, and what's interesting in that is that even they have often had acute trauma at some point. It's the people around them. It's the spouse who signed the prenup, who can't leave them because if you leave, you're not going to get anything from the divorce. It's the children who can't have an honest conversation with their parents because if you have an honest conversation, they're not going to pay for your life. It's the richest people I know in this city who can't understand why we don't come for them with pitchforks and why there isn't a revolution, and don't understand that most people don't know what it means if you've got £30 million invested in, I won't give away this, the richest people I know in this city are really scared that we're going to come for their money. because they can't see why we wouldn't. And that's a frightening situation to be in. You end up trying to maximise your children's chances, so you isolate them by sending them to these very segregated schools, and then they never feel that they fit in. But I can give you, I think the best way to think about this, there's been studies of Paul's winners. Camelot will not let us study the Camelot winners, by the way, because they know what we find. Imagine you've got a scratch card now, and you win, say, £4 million this weekend, okay? Now, and just for 30 seconds, think through, what are you going to do? And you may have ticked the no publicity box, right? And you might be here with somebody who really matters to you tonight, but you haven't told them either. You'd probably tell them, but you might not. I mean, it might cross your mind. In fact, this is the time you really can walk out if you've had enough, right? And you could give them something. But how much would you give them? You've got 4 million. Would you give them one? I mean, they've put up with you for many years. But one's quite a lot because it only leaves you with 3. This may sound silly, but work your way through it. And then what about your cousins, your siblings, mum and dad, your children? How much? What's the fair share of your £4 million? And it shouldn't take you very long to begin to see that you've got a problem with this. And it's a messy problem. But all you have to do is not buy that scratch card to do it. And you may not believe it. I've had people sit there going, no, I wouldn't have a problem. the studies that there have been, which are general household studies, show that small wins are beneficial. 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, sort things out in people's lives, make them much happier. It's these large amounts of money that are problematic.
I mean, like you say, it's quite tricky for me to feel sorry for the rich people, but I take your point. You write that one person's impending crisis may already be the daily reality of countless others around the world, and I think that's sort of what I've taken away from this book above all else. And it's full of really interesting facts and studies and things that you can dazzle your friends with, but is this idea that if, like me, you have a thing that you really care about, it might be climate change, it might be education, it might be not having a Thames full of poo, it might be that your parents are going to be cared for in their later life. You can't actually solve that crisis until we can solve the crisis, until we have already alleviated or improved those crises that actually occupy most people's thoughts most of the time.
Yeah.
So until we can sort out the cost of living, unemployment, those things, we're not going to get anywhere with climate change and those.
And then you can get very fast. So the countries which have got the lowest inequality in Europe have got the closest target dates for net zero and mean it. And okay, this is not a great example because of where they got their wealth from, but the country that invests most in biodiversity worldwide is Norway. The countries that do the least to help with the harder, further distance in time, further distance away problems are the ones with the biggest problems at home, like the USA, which is not helping the world in general. Doesn't tend to go out and do good things more widely, and hasn't solved or even begun to tackle many of its internal problems. There is a kind of nice ending to this book, which you can probably predict, but we're kind of fortunate at the moment that, as far as I can see, for the biggest crises, in terms of what people say concern them, but also if you were just to rank things by premature death, the biggest crises, the solutions are interdependent and similar. And it would be terrible if there were one set of issues for humans where the solutions to them were the opposite to what we needed for another set.
Right.
And it is fortunate, I think, for these that greater equality reduces carbon pollution, makes it easier to have better education, shares things out so that people aren't trying to get more for themselves, which you try to in a unequal society. So if you just take banks, rather than having banks having a few people being paid 4 million a year and discovering that somebody else is paid 6 and then asking, I want another 2 million, if your top bankers are paid much less, as they were when I was a child, less than doctors, it's much easier to employ many other people in your banks, as we used to do, not necessarily as cashiers or a boring job, but something useful, like helping people who can't understand their bills, or doing, can you actually imagine a bank doing stuff you actually need for people? And it might sound like utopia, but in a country like Portugal, they have a state service called Lost My Purse, Lost My Wallet, where if you lose your purse or your wallet, you phone a number, and a government agency sorts it out for you. Now you can get a private, I'm one of those really sad people, I won't ask you to identify, but if any of you sign up to one of those things whereby all your credit cards are cancelled for you, but every year you have to renew your credit card, it may just be me, you can tell I'm a worrier. But it's a private scheme, I pay £30 a year for this, and I have to remember to update all my credit cards by hand written down. In Portugal, they just have all the credit cards, the government has it, you don't have to pay anything because you're paying for your taxes. It costs a fraction, of amount of money to do this, and it's far more efficient. And at that moment, you're going to feel around for where your wallet is, okay, in your purse. It's a really good communal state service, and it isn't rewarding people for fecklessness and not being good at looking after what's in your pocket. And sorry, I'm going off a tangent.
I just want to get. Did you just say that bankers earned less than GPs when you were young?
Yeah.
Bloody hell.
Yeah. The idea of, because casino banking wasn't allowed.
Okay.
It was a controlled sector. The highest paid people were surgeons and doctors, and a few others for strange reasons. But you've got 1% of people always have to be in the top 1% everywhere. No matter how equal your imaginary society is, you're always going to have a 1%. So the question is, who are you going to put in that 1%? And you can play various games with, whose job is most horrible, was it what? But actually having to spend a lifetime dealing with illness and death that most of us are only going to have to deal with ourselves and a few of our relatives, and we're going to find this the most traumatic thing in our lives. I knew at a very early age not to try and become a doctor, because why would you want to spend your life with ill people? The problem is, but it's nice that people do, but I wish they would think about it. In an unequal society like we are now, it's an aspiration. You go to an elite girls' school just outside London, you're getting all your A's, and your family say you need to be a doctor, and you go off to become a doctor. You don't realise this is what it's actually about, and then you try to get out in many cases of actually doing the job it is you've been trained to do at great expense, and this is a stupid system. Yeah. It's a bit like becoming a dentist because you want to make money, rather than becoming a dentist because you actually really enjoy the idea of fixing people's teeth. My best friend at university, grew up in Pakistan, came here when he was 10, turned up at Newcastle to do dentistry, and that's when I met him, and quickly became a friend. And then on day 2 he said to me, nobody else on my course seems to want to do dentistry because they want to fix people's teeth. They wanted to be doctors, but he wouldn't let them in to do that. Or they want to be well off, but they're not fascinated with tooth pain, which is why he became a dentist. And I'm not. I just had to have a tooth taken out in Finland.
You love Finland.
I love Finland. Well, you would love Finland because Sana's just the best ever emergency dentist. The cost €209. People know each other in a more equal society. You're not going to make profit. She's never going to see me again, right? Still does a far, far better job than any dental service in an unequal. Apologies to somebody who's a dentist here, but dentistry in Oxford is now largely about profit making, because you have to make more money than a dentist could on the NHS money you'll get, because you couldn't afford a house in the city otherwise. So we've geared our society up to create toothache for anybody who can't afford it and can't stay and get on that NHS list. And even if you can get onto the NHS, you're not going to get seen that quickly. And this is utterly ridiculous. So you'll have friends who are born in other countries in Europe who fly back home for their dental treatment, right? It isn't just me. And the fact that this is common I mean, you're worried about the climate? You want to solve a climate crisis? You solve things like dentistry. So people don't fly to a dentist. Right.
Lovely.
I'm trying to gear you up so you ask
Yes, okay.
questions. Yeah.
I will open it up to questions. Who wants to go first? Oh, come on. Yes, Soren.
Thank you so much. I hugely enjoy your books. My name is Soren. I'm an anaesthetist up at... I guess a big crisis that I am worried about is the way AI and sort of the techno-joy is sort of rushing into all sorts of industries. And AI is particularly concerning for two reasons. One is private-driven, so you don't know what's underlying motive and so forth. But the other thing is also the data that is based upon is for the most part incredibly biased and very unequal and sort of supporting racist tropes in many ways. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I mean, it's very present also within human geography.
There's a lovely header towards the end of the book which says China and AI and women. Like, here are the other things we've got to worry about. Jesus.
To put in, my editor Leo was really worried about AI. People in publishing are worried about AI because they're worried it can be replaced.
Yeah.
Well, in a way, this isn't a bad pun. So, my take on AI in the book, and I did read books on that AI, which my favourite is Steve Wolfram's book, and he's an expert of maths. Very short book, and I think it's page 97. He goes, the neural networks aren't going to scale up much. This is almost as good as it gets, which might be good news. Well, it really is kind of good news if you're really worried about sentient beings. I'm sceptical about brand new crises that haven't been around for very long, because they almost always, 99 times out of 100, turn out not to be a problem. There are crises that do turn out to be a problem. The 12 years between realising that you could bang two atoms together and us actually doing it in Hiroshima, then we had a problem. But seriously, for every big, major, new crisis that largely we put in the world, we have this huge number that we imagine. Things like, if you remember, there's a point with killer bees. Probably none of you are any longer worried about the killer bees coming together. Asteroids and meteors, whatever. This is our fourth AI revolution. The first was very niche. It was 1968 and John Conway's Game of Life, who was a mathematician. But John Conway proved you could create a computer that could reprogram a computer by doing and not and or gates. And it was kind of nerdily exciting, the idea of, because once you've got a computer that can reprogram itself, you've got the beginnings of this. When I was doing my PhD in 1989, neural networks had got to the point of being able to emulate a sea slug, which is a very basic creature, but it was exciting and interesting. And the first applications were reading number plates and pictures, then translation, which was a big thing, and now this slightly mesmerising thing of, this looks really good and really clever, but it doesn't look any more clever, I'd argue, than it looked to people when they first saw a mechanical loom weaving cloth. That would have been stunning. Producing something better than a human can do itself. And what it's doing is producing middle of the range, politically central arguments, which end up being more racist because that's what's out there. It produces you a different thing every time you ask it, because it can't produce the same thing again. If you're being really optimistic about it, it should kill off the terrible Oxford tutorial essay, because it's producing, in effect, Oxford tutorial essays. Not that imaginative, not that different, not edgy, not, a bland model answer. And we may possibly... The reason why my punt of saying this is just another one, we'll get used to it, and then we notice that all the covering letters are written by AI when people apply for a job. And I'm looking... Two of my students are here, whose first language, no, your first language was English, wasn't it? But you like AI. I do think for people trying to write in their second or third language, this is partly a blessing, although it does mean for us that there will not be people forced to learn English at that level. But I don't think we should see this as a terrible thing in the world, because I'm never going to learn another language in my life. The reason why it's not a stupid punt is if I'm wrong, if it is getting that much cleverer, it is going to be in charge. And it won't matter if I'm right or wrong anymore. It'll be making the decisions. But don't be scared of the very recent latest fad. Just look at the rate to which those things that suddenly came up in the past as being the thing we should be really scared about has disappeared almost to the point we forgot about it. I did a book called Population 10 Billion where I came up with 44 ways in which the world was supposed to be ending, which had the killer bees as the least. And we're worried. We're good at spotting these things and worrying about them, but they go as quickly as new worries happen. The book begins with the risk experts of the world. They have an organisation and they meet at Davos and they're chief risk engineers for companies. It's good money, but you're being paid to worry. And they're absolutely paranoid about computer firms being taken over, which does happen. You see Marks and Spencer's recently. But the worst computer attack we've had has been that software designed to stop computer attacks that went wrong. So you don't necessarily get your predictions right about these things. And all the way from the Y2 bug onwards, this idea the machine is going to stop. That is a fear. But the machine so far has been remarkably resilient.
So worry about weaving, worry about number plate recognition, and then worry about AI. You had a question, and then at the back.
I have two questions. Okay. One is in terms of just following the thread of what's the next crisis. So the one that really, really bothers me is pollution, and that intersects with geography and inequality, because the poorest people live in the most polluted areas. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And the second is that can you talk about one rewarding experience in the whole process of putting together this book?
Okay, what's hard?
Can you give us a glimmer of joy?
I don't have it in this book of mine. So pollution is interesting to me in terms of the falls there be. So you can hardly see it now, but if you look very carefully when going around Oxford, you can just about see a few of the blacks on the stones, the ones they haven't cleaned, from when this city was, even this city was so polluted and the cars, what's coming out was so bad that the stones of the buildings. Chinese cities now, the levels are dropping and dropping and dropping. So we are still, but we're only putting sewage in the Thames because we're helping the rest of Europe understand why you don't allow greedy people to own your water, which you will die if you don't drink. But in general, our rivers are much, much cleaner than they were when we were at the height of industrialisation, and pollution levels are dropping in many, many, many parts of the world. And we don't tend to celebrate that, which is it's a good thing. We don't rest on our laurels. We worry about more of it and where are the incinerators? But one problem about not celebrating all our successes is we can have a young generation who just think we're doomed, because all they hear is we've got 12 years to save the earth and everything else is going wrong. We don't actually list the genuine achievements that people have done when they've realised they've made a mistake, and how to deal with it and how to make things better. Instead, we tell them that capitalism is wonderful and the market mechanism will sort things out, and capitalism has ended poverty, which is completely untrue. And so I do wish that we would do a better job of talking about better. And the thing that made me happy in writing the book, that I found it really hard to end it, in that I thought, as I started the book, that there would be a really clear thing to be absolutely concerned about. and that by reading lots of other people's concerns and looking at this, there will be something that I hadn't thought of that would worry me. And to actually find the thing that's been worrying me for years is worrying other people was joyous. You know, at least the majority of the world's middle class in filling surveys do think that inequality is the biggest problem and care about poverty and worry about getting by. You know, it's kind of halfway to solving a problem is realising you've got one.
A problem shared is a problem halved, says Danny Dorling.
Well, in the 1980s, you know, the young men running around this town who loved Margaret Thatcher as teenagers, they believed this cult that said inequality is good. Let the tall poppies grow tall, and we'll get trickle down from the wonder of inequality. And we've gone through that, and we've gone through it globally. And it's okay. And all these surveys are from before Trump wins. They're before Musk kind of exposes himself and his life to the planet, right? So people knew that the super rich were a problem and inequality was a problem before the latest demonstration to the world, which helps people vote the right way in Australia and in Canada. And if I'm being really optimistic, so far the tally since Trump came in around the world is people are they've got a model of what will happen if they do vote for the big strong man, right? They can see it and they can hear him. Romania, the latest election in Romania. Now, some proper political scientists needs to begin to look at these when there's enough of them and actually say this is helping places that are not the United States. But it's quite possible that's occurring. We never celebrate the fall of the far right. We always report the rise of it. So, you know, Golden Dawn went away, were prosecuted. Poland voted out its far right government. The far right generally fall as much as they rise. We have to worry about fascism coming, but we've been talking about it being just about to happen for a very long time. That not saying be complacent, but don't look at all of this and go, we're doomed. Go, and that's where the book started. It's a luxury to be worrying about polycrises. It's good we are, but you don't want to become despondent because you think the situation cannot be improved. Because it is being improved in many, many cases. In this country, it's led by Scotland, which is the only place in the UK where child poverty has fallen in the last few years in parts of Scotland. Has the lowest rate of child poverty in Britain. If you want a single policy message for Britain, how did Scotland go from having the highest child poverty rate to the lowest? What are they doing? And it's quite simple. They're taxing rich people more and giving the money to poor families. Right? It's not that hard. But the blessed thing is they've done it, and we're finding, turns out people don't drink the money. They make sure their children don't go cold, and they make sure that they're fed. And when they're growing taller, just to be really helpful. Yeah.
We're going to take the question from the back. Yes.
Yeah, just thank you, Danny. Yes, fantastic stuff. Just mentioning Toby Young, I'm reminded of the anecdote that he was just undershooting the grades necessary to get into his Oxford College place until his father made a call on his behalf and got him in. Yeah. His father being Michael Young, the author of The Rise of the Meritocracy. Yeah. But that aside, I'm attracted by your conflation of housing and war. And the image that it calls to my mind is Palestinians looking over the razor wire at a West Bank settlement. And that is now the pinch point, isn't it? Because wars are spiralling upwards to crisis proportions because of the degradation of the international system to restrain the war-making behaviour of states. And there you have the most difficult case, a privileged state, a military ally occupying this privileged position in serial violation of every norm and law of war and general conduct towards an occupied population. Just today, finally, the British government might be getting around to making more than rhetorical and other low-cost concessions to the protest movement. Yeah. What are the prospects for breathing new life into this system and forestalling the spiralling crisis of war in this world?
It's a great one to end on. War's where I collected the most data. Partly, I did a paper maybe 20 or 30 years ago called Wars and Massacres of the 20th Century, where it seems a bit uncensored, but I tried to add them all together. And in general, after World War II, despite the huge number of civil wars and other proxy wars, the amount of people dying in war was going down. It went down slightly tragically, ironically, until the point that I've forgotten his name, that the author wrote Better Angels of Our Nature.
Steven Pinker.
Yeah, the point that Steven Pinker wrote that violence is going is tragically when it turned. You know, it should, and it's been rising since then, but not that fast. So we are still at a lower level than we were in the 60s and the 70s. A huge number of people, almost certainly involved in the military, which you can guess I don't particularly like the military, but most of the angels who stopped wars being worse and certainly prevented nuclear war have been in the military. And we don't actually realise how many people have been involved. The map of war death, I should hold it up, but you see, it's every country with its size made proportional to all the deaths from anything that the Swedish academics count as being a war death. It looks like a crusade. I'm not sure about. This is the first time I've talked about this book in public. I've got to think about, but it looks like a crusade on Muslim countries when you look at who's being killed. And that's a shock to see. Most of the weapons that are being used are not made in these countries. These are proxy wars between other powers happening in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. The one exception is Rwanda, but again there was huge influence from outside in that. The uplift and Israel and Palestine are a circle, and because my data ends, I think, in 2023, it would have doubled in size. But this puts it in the context. It's so hard to talk about. If the eyes of the world had not been on Gaza and Lebanon, I do think we're going to end on a low point, but it's worth thinking how much worse it would have been had we not been looking. It is absolutely terrible what is happening, but we have an intolerance of war now which we didn't have in the relatively recent past. And so now people are utterly shocked by what is occurring, and crimes above war. You know, crimes where you're targeting children, and you're targeting women. We have an intolerance which is higher than in the past, and needs to be raised higher and higher again. It's not, as far as I'm concerned, so much the international institutions and the UN and so on who will solve this. It is a global recognition that this is intolerable, unspeakable, can never be forgiven, and if you behave in this way you are a complete pariah, and we will have nothing to do with you, and we will not sanction it in any way whatsoever. And that belief needs to rise. In this country, we need to ask why we were the runner-up to the USA in being complicit, what the implications of being complicit could be, including international trials, which probably explains why Starmer didn't hire the person expected to be the Attorney General, but somebody different when he won the election. I suspect he was personally worried about being found to be complicit in war crimes for what the UK was doing. I could be wrong, I'm willing to say that's my suspicion. It's true, we cut 10% of our arms exports, but we are still, these are British-made weapons that are killing children there, and we are still in that position. But you ask youngsters across this country what they think of what's going on, and they've seen the bodies on their phones. They are 95% and above against the atrocities. A lot of students in my university were a bit complacent until they called in the police and had a dozen of them arrested and taken to outlying prison cells in Oxfordshire. And suddenly every undergraduate, because these are their friends being arrested for a peaceful protest, suddenly every undergraduate in the University of Oxford knows what this is about, who had been ignoring tents before. So you're watching a growing realisation in a similar way to Vietnam, but this is one I'll end on. The greatest similarity is what happened in Oxford in 1938. And I sent the information on this to the Vice-Chancellor on the morning before those arrests were made. And I do wish I'd just sent it like 2 weeks earlier. In 1938, there was a student protest movement against war and genocide. In 1938. Dennis Healey was a young student. He was a communist student. He later became Chancellor of the Exchequer on the right of Labour. And Dennis Healey smuggled a copy of Guernica into the senior common room at Balliol as a protest to try to make them think of why were the British kind of going along with Hitler? I mean, we were making the decision which way we went. Why were we going along with Franco? So Dennis did that. That spectacular one of a group of students who organised a play about the creation of a concentration camp. We all know all about concentration camps because we built them in South Africa. And the play was about building a concentration camp on Christchurch Meadow in 1938 to warn about what was happening. These are Oxford University students. And the chief agitator amongst those students was a young student called Iris Murdoch. Yeah. Nobody remembers any of the academics in 1938. Right? But you remember Dennis Healey and Iris Murdoch, and and I'm a local in Oxford, so I don't have a particular love necessarily for Oxford University students. But they've done this before, they do it again. Yeah. We are slowly getting through to a point where war is not something that you can justify in any way, and war crimes exist and they are not forgivable. And you are a pariah and you are no longer a member of some international community if that is how you have behaved, and you will have to face justice at some point. And saying it really, really clearly is, I think, what's required. But this is a small gathering of people in East Oxford. It's easier me doing this here than elsewhere because it's. But if I can't do it at my age, and I was 17 when my mum took me to Greenland Convent. This has been my political life. So, yeah.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for addressing it. We do need to go, but I think, a lovely place to end is you include and forgive me if you're all aware of these, the Socialist Sunday School 10 Commandments. Do you all know these? Would you like a quick reading of them before you go home? Okay. Love your schoolfellows. They will become your fellow workers and companions in life. Number 2, love learning, which is the food of the mind. Be as grateful to your teacher as to your parents. Number 3, make every day holy by good and useful deeds and kindly actions. Number 4, honour good people, be courteous and respect all, bow down to none, which is one you can pick up on. Number 5, do not hate or offend anyone, do not seek revenge, but stand up for your rights and resist tyranny. Number 6, be not cowardly, protect the feeble and love justice. Number 7, remember that all good things of the earth are the result of labour. Whoever enjoys them without working for them is stealing the bread of the worker. Number 8, observe and think in order to discover the truth. Do not believe that what is contrary to reason, and never deceive yourself or others. Number 9, do not think that he who loves his own country must hate and despise other nations, or wish for war, which is a remnant of barbarism. And finally, number 10, help to bring about the day when all nations shall live fraternally together in peace and prosperity. So, no big ask, people of East Oxford, but those are your 10 commandments for this week. Danny, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Caper, for having us, and thank you all for being here. But a round of applause for Danny Dorling.